On a warm summer evening, the streets of Greenville were alive with activity. Teenagers laughed in groups, street vendors called out to passers-by, and the hum of a typical suburban neighborhood filled the air. 17-year-old Marcus Jones, a talented high school track athlete, was rushing home to avoid being late for dinner. Before we move on to telling this story, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and where are you looking from? Your support is very important to us and helps our growing channel to develop and reach more people. Every comment, every like, every post brings us closer to creating a community that defends justice. Thank you for participating with us in this important event. Running across the street at a crosswalk, he accidentally bumped into Officer Derek Callahan, a white police officer notorious for his short temper and controversial behavior. "Watch where you're going," Callahan barked, turning sharply. "I'm sorry," Marcus stammered, backing away. But to Callahan, the apology wasn't enough. "You think you can just run into me like that and walk away?" His voice was sharp, loud enough to draw attention from nearby pedestrians. Marcus raised his hands defensively. "I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, Callahan grabbed his arm. The small confrontation escalated rapidly, with Callahan shoving Marcus against the pavement. A few people stopped to watch, some recording the incident on their phones. What started as a simple shove spiraled into chaos. Fueled by anger and arrogance, Callahan began to pummel Marcus with his fists. Despite Marcus's protests and desperate attempts to shield himself, the blows continued. Bystanders yelled for Callahan to stop, some inching closer, but no one dared physically intervene. "He's just a kid," a woman screamed. Ignoring the shouts, Callahan delivered one final, brutal kick to Marcus's ribs before stepping back, breathing heavily. Marcus lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but the damage was done. Marcus was rushed to Greenville General Hospital in critical condition. The Jones household was quiet that evening, the smell of Cynthia's pot roast lingering in the air as Robert Jones, a decorated police chief in the nearby city of Brighton, sat reviewing case files at the dining table. The quiet was interrupted by the sharp ring of Robert's phone. "Chief Jones," he answered in his usual brisk tone. The voice on the other end trembled. "Sir, this is Officer Monroe from Greenville General. Your son, Marcus, has been brought in. He's in critical condition." The words didn't register at first. "Marcus? Critical? What happened?" Robert's voice rose, drawing Cynthia's attention from the kitchen. "I'm not authorized to share details over the phone, sir," Monroe replied hesitantly. "You need to come to the hospital immediately." Robert's hand shook as he hung up the phone. "It's Marcus," he said hoarsely. Cynthia's eyes widened with fear. "He's hurt. We need to go now." The drive to Greenville General was a blur. Cynthia clutched Robert's hand tightly, her silent prayers filling the void between them. When they arrived, they were directed to the trauma unit. A doctor approached, his face grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Jones, your son sustained severe injuries, blunt force trauma to his head and chest. He's in surgery, but I need you to prepare yourselves. His condition is critical." Cynthia's knees buckled, and Robert caught her, pulling her into his arms. "He's a fighter," Robert whispered, though his own voice cracked with doubt. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. At 3:47 a.m., the surgeon returned. His expression gave away the news before he spoke. "I'm so sorry," the doctor began. "We did everything we could, but the injuries were too severe. Marcus has passed." Cynthia let out a wail that echoed through the sterile hallway, collapsing into Robert's arms. Robert, a man known for his stoic strength, felt his world collapse. He held her tightly, his tears falling silently. Later, sitting in the hospital chapel, Robert whispered, "He was just a kid. How did this happen?" But no answer could lessen the pain of their loss. The morning after Marcus's death, the small city of Greenville buzzed with rumors. News outlets picked up the story, and vague reports of a violent encounter with a police officer began to circulate. At the same time, Robert Jones was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a cup of untouched coffee. He hadn't slept, his mind churning over what had happened to Marcus. Cynthia sat silently beside him, her red-rimmed eyes fixed on the floor. Later that day, Robert received a call from Greenville PD. The officer in charge of the investigation invited him to the precinct. "We need to share some details," the officer had said, his voice measured but tense. Robert agreed, though he dreaded hearing the specifics of how his son had been hurt. At the precinct, Detective Sandra Willis greeted Robert in a private room. She was a seasoned investigator, known for her no-nonsense demeanor. "Chief Jones," she began cautiously, "I want to first extend my deepest condolences. What happened to your son was a tragedy, and we're committed to uncovering the truth." Robert nodded, though his patience was wearing thin. "I just want answers. What happened to Marcus?" Willis hesitated before sliding a folder across the table. Inside were blurry photographs from the scene, Marcus lying on the pavement, his face bruised, his body crumpled. Next to the images was a preliminary report. "Your son was involved in an altercation with Officer Derek Sims," she explained. "Witnesses claim Marcus was crossing the street when he accidentally bumped into Sims. Words were exchanged, and it escalated into a physical confrontation. Sims used force to subdue Marcus, excessive force." Robert's jaw clenched. "Excessive? My son's dead, Detective. That goes beyond excessive." Willis nodded solemnly. "There's more, sir. We've reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby store. It shows Sims striking Marcus repeatedly, even after he was clearly subdued. It also reveals that Sims never called for medical assistance. It was bystanders who called 911. Cynthia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up again. Robert's face hardened. "What about Sims? Is he in custody?" Willis sighed. "He's been placed on administrative leave while we investigate. But, Chief Jones, there's something you need to know. The officer involved in your son's death, he's part of your own department." The words hit Robert like a blow to the chest. "What?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Sims is one of my officers." "Yes," Willis confirmed quietly. "He transferred to your department 2 years ago. His record isn't spotless. There were prior complaints of misconduct, including the use of excessive force, but none resulted in disciplinary action." Robert stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Why wasn't I informed of this before he was hired? How did this slip through the cracks?" Willis looked at him sympathetically. "That's what we're trying to piece together. Right now, our priority is building a case against Sims." Robert's mind reeled as he stormed out of the precinct. The tragedy of his son's death was already unbearable, but to learn that one of his own officers was responsible felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. He had dedicated his life to upholding justice, yet now the system he trusted had failed his own family. Back at home, Robert shared the revelation with Cynthia. "It was one of my officers," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I trusted this man to protect people, and instead, he killed our son." Cynthia shook her head in disbelief. "How could this happen? How could someone like that wear a badge?" "We'll get answers," Robert vowed. "And Sims will pay for what he's done." For the first time in his career, Robert found himself on the other side of the system he had served for decades, seeking justice, not as a police chief, but as a grieving father. The investigation was swift and thorough, led by internal affairs and outside oversight to avoid bias. Evidence against Callahan mounted, witness statements, surveillance footage, and body cam recordings painted a damning picture of his actions that night. "He didn't resist," one witness testified. "That cop just kept hitting him, like he wanted to teach him a lesson or something." Callahan was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His defense attorney claimed the officer had acted in self-defense, a claim that enraged the public even further. Robert struggled to balance his role as a grieving father and an officer of the law. His position made him a target of criticism from both sides. Activists accused him of protecting Callahan, while officers whispered that he was betraying the badge. Late at night, Robert sat in Marcus's room, staring at his son's track trophies. "I should have protected you," he whispered. Cynthia placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make sure he pays for what he did." Callahan's trial drew national attention. Prosecutors painted him as a violent man who used his badge to hide his prejudice, citing prior complaints against him. The defense argued that Callahan had felt threatened, pointing to Marcus's athletic build and framing the incident as a tragic misunderstanding. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Callahan to life in prison without parole. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by tears of relief from Marcus's family and cheers from supporters. Marcus's death became a rallying cry for change. Activists pushed for police reform, demanding better training and accountability measures. The Jones family established a foundation in Marcus's name to support victims of police violence and fund scholarships for young athletes. At his sentencing, Callahan stared blankly as Robert addressed the court. "You took my son from me," he said, his voice steady. "But you will never take his legacy." Though the pain of losing Marcus would never fully heal, his family found solace in the knowledge that his story had sparked a movement, a call to action for justice, equality, and humanity.